Welcome back to Real Takes, where we are all movie love all the time. I'm Stott, and I'm going to start tonight by talking about an organization I care about, like I always do. And tonight I'm going to talk about the British Film Institute, which has a magazine called Sight and Sound, which every 10 years puts out a new list of the greatest films ever made, the 100 greatest films ever made. And a new list just came out, and if you're on film Twitter, then you know all about this. And there's been much discussion about how the list has been shaken up in the last 10 years. And Jean Dielman by Chantal Akerman is now #1 on the list, which is very exciting and so cool. Anyway, the British Film Institute does so much to preserve film, support film culture, support filmmakers. I have a kitty cat on my lap. And it would be great if you could support them either by becoming a member or giving a donation or subscribing to the magazine, or they have like a film player that you can use and rent movies from them. So there are lots of ways to engage with them and support them, and I'll link to them below. They do a lot for film, both historically and in present times, so highly recommend them. So tonight we're basically in the last week of Sagittarius. Next week we'll be right on the cusp into Capricorn, and next week will be our last Real Takes in this format. And then I'm going to take a break, and I already have an idea for what I'm going to do next. And but it'll be different. It'll still be lots of film love and lots of talking about movies, but differently. So I got short-circuited, as you all know I do sometimes, about what to talk about. And I wanted to talk about so many different Sagittarian filmmakers that I'm just going to talk about all of them. So I first wanted to talk about Otto Preminger because I really see him as like a quintessential Sagittarian filmmaker. He worked within the Hollywood system for most of his career, but he was a real rebel, and he was probably the most successful or best known director who really fought against the censorship that was happening in Hollywood in the 40s and 50s. So during his movie making years, like the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, he made a film called The Moon is Blue, which isn't anything special. It's a little romantic comedy, but it talks much more openly about sex and seduction than films did then. And in fact, films were not supposed to use the word sex coming out of Hollywood. And he fought to have this script, left the way he wanted it. He made the film the way he wanted it. And then a bunch of theaters around the country wouldn't show it. I mean, and this is, if you ever get to see this movie, which is hard to screen, it's laughable how tame it is compared to what we watch now. But there were a bunch of films that refused to show it, and he sued them. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he won. So that was one thing he did. He made The Man with the Golden Arm, which was a movie starring Frank Sinatra playing a heroin addict, and he showed heroin use in the film, which you weren't supposed to do in the 40s and 50s. It's really interesting to remember that the golden age of cinema happened under a huge cloud of censorship. So he made not one but 2 films with all-black casts. He made Carmen Jones, which starred Dorothy Dandridge, for which she was nominated for an Oscar, and Harry Belafonte. And he also made Porgy and Bess, which is very hard to see, and I've never seen it. It doesn't get shown very much. I think there are rights issues about it. So he made those 2 films. And he also, there's one other, he hired Dalton Trumbo when Dalton Trumbo was still blacklisted to write one of his scripts, and insisted on crediting him. So Kirk Douglas then hired Dalton Trumbo for something else and credited him on that, for Spartacus, I think, like 6 months or 8 months later. But Otto Preminger really did it first. And then also, very near and dear to my heart, he made a movie called Daisy Kenyon, which is actually one of my favorite Joan Crawford films. It also stars Dana Andrews and Henry Fonda, and it's a love triangle, and it's clunky. It's not the greatest film ever made either, but it's a much more like adult look at, you know, a love triangle and marriage gone bad and cheating than so many movies of the time. And there's this scene in it where this man tries to force himself on Joan Crawford. And, you know, it's so interesting to watch my reaction when these sorts of things happen in classic cinema, because the script is the man forces himself on the woman goes, no, no, and then she succumbs and is in a state of desire and bliss, right? Like, this happens so much in classic cinema. And in this scene, I was like, oh, here we go, she's going to submit, and then she doesn't. And she fights this man off, and she really fights him off. And I was stunned when I saw it. And then he tries to force himself on her again. I thought, oh, she's going to give in this time. And she doesn't. And she fights him off again. And then I thought, because this is part of the script too, like she would then apologize to him, like, oh, I'm sorry. Are you okay? Like, try to take care of his feelings, because that happens all the time too. And she doesn't. She says, I'll never forgive you. And it's so righteous in comparison to so much of so many portrayals of messed up sexual dynamics in classic Hollywood. So that is an interesting movie. Plus, there's also a scene actually shot in Provincetown, which is kind of fun and exciting. So I like Daisy Kenyon a lot. Now, Otto Preminger had an uneven career, and it's widely thought that his two strongest films are Laura, which some people consider the best film noir ever made. It is certainly creepy. It also stars Dana Andrews, with whom he worked a lot. And then the other movie people sort of list as his most important is Anatomy of a Murder, and which is great and has a great cast and full of suspense. So highly recommend those. And then people also recognize Bonjour Tristesse as being a sort of certain moment in filmmaking. And he also made a Western. He worked across all genres. He made a Western with Marilyn Monroe and Robert Mitchum called River of No Return. So his filmography was uneven, but he was working with a lot of interesting ideas and pushing at a lot of boundaries in a way that I really appreciate. So all hail Sagittarian filmmaker Otto Preminger. Then I also wanted to talk about Fritz Lang, because he's such an incredible artist of cinema. So Fritz Lang was a German filmmaker who started in the silent era, and when the Nazis started to rise to power in Germany, he fled to Hollywood, as many filmmakers did, which is part of how film noir came about, was these German filmmakers bringing a certain kind of aesthetic to the American storytelling experience. But before he came to America, and while he was working in silent film, he made two incredibly important films. He made Metropolis and he made M. Now, Metropolis is widely talked about as the first sci-fi film, and that might seem like an odd thing for me to want to talk about, because I don't think I've talked about any sci-fi films during this whole series of almost 70 episodes. But Metropolis is so special. It lives outside of genre. It was so ahead of its time. It's so creative. It's visionary, literally and figuratively, and blew me away. I got to see it on film, with the multiple reels, which I'm so grateful for. So highly recommend Metropolis for all film lovers. And then M stars the great Peter Lorre, who plays a child murderer who's on the loose in a city. And it's a suspense film, and it's also a statement about how people react in panic in communities, and kind of all the different factions of society and how they kind of go into their default modes. It's it's a heartbreaking, searing film that I highly recommend. So Fritz Lang came to the US, and he is most remembered when it comes to his talking films for his film noir catalog. So he made You Only Live Once, he made The Woman in the Window, Scarlet Street, Clash by Night, The Big Heat, Human Desire. He just really slayed it in the film noir genre, and The Big Heat and Clash by Night in particular are incredible. And then Scarlet Street and The Woman in the Window are both with Edward G. Robinson as the lead, and he's always great. So he didn't find the same level of artistry. Now, honestly, in Hollywood, there wasn't really a place for that. So, I don't know if he just didn't feel like there was the opportunity or the context to do what he had been doing in Germany, but he certainly made some marvelous film noir films that are totally worth watching. But if you've never seen Metropolis or M, can't recommend them enough. Please watch. And then I also want to talk about George Stevens, who started directing in the mid-30s. Actually, Katharine Hepburn gave him a big break. She tapped him to direct Alice Adams, which she starred in with Fred McMurray. And she just he'd only made some shorts. Maybe he'd made one not very successful feature, but she had this strong feeling about him, and she tapped him to make that movie. And for the rest of the 30s and the early 40s, he had a very successful Hollywood career, making like kind of standard light Hollywood fare. He made Annie Oakley. He made one of the Fred Astaire Ginger Rogers films, Swing Time. He made the first Hepburn Tracy pairing, Woman of the Year. And then he made two of my favorite romantic comedies from the golden age of cinema. He made Talk of the Town and The More the Merrier, both starring Jean Arthur. Now, Jean Arthur is more famous for the role she played in Frank Capra films for You Can't Take It With You, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but wait, I'm having a blank. Yes, she was in You Can't Take It With You. And Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Oh, and Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. That's the third one with Gary Cooper. So, but she said that George Stevens was actually her favorite director. And she made these two rom-coms with him. I adore The Talk of the Town. It just pleases me to no end. So it's Jean Arthur, Cary Grant, and Ronald Colman together, which is such an unlikely trio of actors, but it looks like they're having an incredible amount of fun. The setup is ridiculous the way it is for so many films from this era, and once you just get over that and kind of let your belief be suspended, you can have a lot of fun watching The Talk of the Town, which is about Jean Arthur rents her house to Ronald Colman, who's a prestigious judge, while she is harboring a fugitive from justice, played by Cary Grant, in her attic, and all the chaos and hilarity that ensues. And it's sort of rom-com meets like legal exploration. There's a lot of legal philosophy discussed, and it really becomes a threesome movie. They all form this kind of loving bond with each other, and everyone's trying to make the choice that will be the best for the other people, which is interesting because often when you have a triangulated dynamic in these rom-coms, it's everyone competing with everybody else to get what they want. And in this one, it's everyone, the tension comes from people pulling away to try to make the best thing happen for somebody else. It's very sweet and tender at the end of the day. And it's a shade of Cary Grant we don't see anywhere else. He plays a bit of a rebel, which I like. And then The More the Merrier came out in 1943, and that stars, again, a rental movie, actually. Jean Arthur rents a room out. She's a working girl living in an apartment in Washington, D.C., and there's a massive housing shortage in Washington, D.C. because of World War II and all the people that have come to D.C. to help run the war effort. And she ends up renting out a room to Charles Lawton, who then rents out half his room to Joel McCrea. And again, hilarity and romance ensue. But it's tons of fun. But George Stevens has this fascinating thing that happened to him and several other directors in the 40s. So after the More the Merrier, he went to work for the government for 2 or 3 years, making films for the war effort. And he went over to Europe and helped shoot things and helped edit, newsreel for, American movie theaters. And he was there when some of the concentration camps were liberated. And he just couldn't go back to doing what he'd done before. He couldn't go back to making these light, potentially superficial, comedic movies. And he became a completely different filmmaker. And he became most famous for making A Place in the Sun, Shane, and Giant. Those are his 3 most famous, most lasting, most well-known films, rightfully so. A Place in the Sun is an American masterpiece, and one should absolutely see it. And I respect all of those films and hope you see all of them. But the film that kind of touches my heart is that it's not the first one he made after coming back from the war. It's the second one, but it's called I Remember Mama. And it stars Irene Dunne and Barbara Bel Geddes, a very young Barbara Bel Geddes. And it's about a Norwegian immigrant family living in San Francisco. And it's this very sweet, almost quaint family story about the mother of this family and how they survive. And I don't know, it just grabs my heart. I'm actually not a big crier when it comes to movies. It kind of takes something for a movie to make me cry. And the first scene of I Remember Mama makes me cry. So there's something about it that just touches me so deeply. And Irene Dunne gives this beautiful, heartfelt performance as the matriarch of this family finding their way in a new country and, counting every penny and working together to survive. And, on the one hand, it's, I'm a little skeptical of late 40s cinema in the US that celebrates motherhood, because it was the beginning of a very conservative time in our country, and all of these women had gone to work while men were at war. And then there was this huge propaganda effort to get women to feel good about just being in the home and having children and, cooking. And I have a lot of respect for the work of motherhood, but it was a time when women were being constrained in an overt way in our country out of any kind of ambition outside of the home. But there's a way that this film kind of subverts all of that. First of all, it really celebrates her work in this film in a deeply respectful way. And then there's something kind of proto-feminist about this film. She supports her daughter's desire to be a writer. She supports her other daughter's desire to be a veterinarian. Her uncle is living with a woman out of wedlock and she doesn't shun her. There's a lot of kind of unexpected, open, non-traditional sentiment in this film. And that's surprising. Centered around this mother who devotes her whole life to caring for her children and keeping her family together. But it's just a very beautiful, heartfelt film that deeply moves me every time I see it. And I find it interesting, like, to take these two movies that George Stevens made right before the war, The More the Merrier, The Talk of the Town, that are so much fun. And then sort of throw that up against I Remember Mama and his, his need to become a more serious storyteller and to look at deeper themes. And I Remember Mama would then take him into these much more challenging stories like A Place in the Sun and Shane and Giant. So just a big celebration for Sagittarian filmmakers this week. Otto Preminger, Fritz Lang, and George Stevens. Please check out their films if you haven't. I'll put links to the ones that I mentioned below, and comment below and let me know if you've seen any of them. And please don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and I will see you next Wednesday.
Thanks for watching Real Takes. Hit the subscribe button below so the algorithms will tell you when new episodes are out. And if you want to support Real Takes, please visit my Patreon page where you can join at any tier from $2 to $100 per thing I make. The $15 tier is specifically about supporting Real Takes, and you'll get behind the scenes information and be thanked in future videos. See you next Wednesday.